I really don't know that I need to give much of a formal introduction to the House Minority Leader Scott Inman. We are very grateful to have him here, and we're going to talk tonight about the not the special session. It's not going to be a very special session, actually. The legislative session that starts a week from Monday, right? And bring everybody up to date on perhaps what's going to happen, and we'll kind of chit chat for a few minutes, and then I'll throw it open for questions from the audience. And Scott, I hate to put you on the spot like this, but I really, from the outset, need to know whether you are using a private server or only the state server. Do I need to know? Inquiring minds want to know these things. No, seriously. Budget is obviously, this session is all about money, really, when you get right down to it, more than ever before. Well, it was last year, I suppose, too, but it seems more than ever before. So success or failure of this session depends on what in your mind?
Sure. I appreciate it. Let me, before I answer the question, Arnold, I appreciate the invitation. I want to thank you all for being here. This is a humbling experience, I'll be very honest with you. I had no idea there'd be this many folks here. I assumed that you all got lost and were expecting somebody else to come speak. I think the very first one of these that Arnold did here at Full Circle, I had the privilege of serving in this capacity, and it was in the room around the corner in a much smaller space. But we had a great turnout in the middle of the afternoon, and then when I found out that we were going to do it in the evening, I thought, well, I mean, let's be honest, people have things to do. They're going to be out to supper, they'll be doing something else. And to see that we've like quadrupled the crowd that was there just about to where we are today really is humbling. I thought for sure that the only people who would be here would be my wife and my kids. That's over here. And I have one constituent in the room, I think, unless there's anybody else that lives in Del City or South Oklahoma City. And then I have my honors history teacher from Del City High School here, and my Spanish teacher. I took four years of Spanish with this woman in 2 years, so we crammed it in. But they're here. They all have a reason to be here. The rest of you all are just crazy. Right? You have no idea what you're in for. But no, let me say this. So to Arnold's point, for those of you who don't know me, I represent Del City, South Oklahoma City. I've been in the Capitol now for 10 years, representing my hometown. I love that. I've been the minority leader for the last 6 years. A privilege of mine to kind of get up and throw rocks every day and try to fight the good fight for those folks that I think deserve to be fought for, right? That's what I do. These have been some really challenging times the last 6 or 8 years. When I first got elected, we had a year or two into it, we had $1 billion surplus. $1 billion surplus. And here we are now. Last year we had a $1.3 billion budget hole. We've got a $900 million plus budget hole. A few years ago it was about a $600 or $700 million hole. In the year before that it was about a $400 or $500 million. And before that it was a couple hundred. It's been that way now for about 6 or 7 years, right? And for those of you who, this is my third panel of the day, by the way. I was on let me say this. When you're in the minority and you only have 26 members of your caucus, right? I had 30 last year, but I've got 26 now. You go to the Capitol every day. You look at the folks on the other side who I think are doing things that oftentimes are not good for just average folks in the state of Oklahoma, and it becomes very frustrating because you stand and sometimes it feels like you're tilting at windmills and sort of spitting into the wind. And then this morning I went to the Middale Public Schools building, and there were a whole bunch of teachers and students that all just, it felt great to be in a room of folks who got it and who understood it. And then this afternoon I was on a panel with the Oklahoma Policy Institute, and some of you, I've seen some other faces who were there, so you're going to hear a lot of what I said over again. But to be in that room with 400 people who all cared about the state, and then to be here tonight gives me hope for the future of the state of Oklahoma. It makes me realize that some of the folks that I work with that I think that are lost and blind when it comes to the real issues, they're not the only ones out there that they get to speak for the state. You have a voice. And so it's an honor to try to represent that. But this issue of what Arnold talked about, the single greatest issue that faces the state of Oklahoma is whether or not we can pay our bills. Period. Can we pay our bills? You have to deal with it in your own personal lives, in your own families, in your own businesses, whatever it is, just whether you can pay your bills. And Oklahoma, for the last 6 or 8 years, has not paid its bills. Matter of fact, education, public education, the thing about which I'm most passionate, has been cut deeper than any other state in the nation. We've got Veterans Affairs has been cut by 23%. You go down DHS, mental health, Department of Public Safety. You go down the list, and we have just watched those core services, the things that everybody cares about, regardless of your political stripes, right? Even the most conservative of folks, or to the most liberal of folks, would say, we ought to probably have a good public school for kids to go to, or we ought to have enough money to where we can pave the potholes, and we ought to have enough money to keep the bad guys locked up and the good guys safe, right? Even those things that we all agree upon, we've watched them just become decimated year after year by the budget cuts. And for the first 5 years of Governor Fallon's administration, and I just met with her a couple of hours ago, so anything you want to know, I'll be glad to visit with you about it. A true story. We had an hour-long meeting. That's the reason I'm late, because I got to a fundraiser late and then got here late. But for the first 5 years of Governor Fallon's administration, all she ever said was, we have a spending problem. That's all she ever said. We have a spending problem. Even as budget cuts kept coming lower and lower, and the revenues kept dropping, she just insisted that we had a spending problem. And my caucus said, no. We've seen $1.5 billion worth of tax cuts, $2 billion worth of tax credits and exemptions, the most generous gross production tax cuts of any major oil and gas producing state in the nation. That's your problem. We have a revenue problem. And the governor kept saying, no, we have a spending problem. And she just continued to slash budgets. Well, this time last year, she took to the podium at the State House, and she announced from her State of the State speech, we have a revenue problem. And I nearly fell over. I was really excited. I thought, thank you, Jesus. We finally got her to the point where she has seen the light, right? And I thought, great, so we're going to get there, right? We finally got her to the position where if you're going to solve the problem, you got to first understand it. And she understood we have a revenue problem. And then what came next was really disappointing. What the governor did next was say, let's make everybody go out and buy a brand new license plate, right? Yeah. I said before, it's the ugliest license plate in the country, right? All courtesy of Governor Mary Fallon. I voted against it for the record, doesn't really matter, right? You ought to buy one anyway, right? But you'll have to buy a new license plate because that was $8 or $9 million that the governor needed to try to fill a $1.3 billion budget hole, right? Not because you needed a new license plate, but because they needed money. Then they went after the earned income tax credit for single working mothers, for example, make $20,000 a year, have 2 kids. She lost $230 on average, right? The income tax cuts that they were so proud of that went into effect last January cost the state about $150 million. And somebody making 20 grand a year saw virtually no benefit, right? But to offset that $150 million income tax cut that they so fundamentally believed in was important to grow the economy, they had to turn around and take $230 out of all the working mothers' pockets in the state of Oklahoma, right? It's really sinful, to be honest with you. It's immoral. But that's what they did. And so I sat back and I watched, and they had other things. We're going to raise sales taxes on things that are just going to be regressive and hurt more folks that I care about and that you care about. And so I got very frustrated because she finally recognized that we need revenue, but instead of looking at what was really burning the house down, all those things that I mentioned, she chose to try to put out the fire by hurting people who didn't benefit from the initial cuts, right? The initial tax cuts, but tried to shift the burden onto their backs. When I met with her today, a few hours ago, I reiterated the fact that if she chose to do that, if she wants to come with another tax on haircuts, for example, right? Or if she wants to come back with another regressive sales tax on something else, my caucus would oppose it unless she came to the table with real reform to say, let's roll back some income tax cuts. Let's readjust the gross production tax cuts. Let's get rid of some of these tax credits and exemptions that don't bring money to the state. I said, if you'll cut a grand bargain with me, then my caucus will help you in other areas. But if you continue to adhere to this idea that you can balance the budget on the backs of poor folks and retirees, then my caucus will continue to oppose you. And so the hope this session is that while she's on board saying we need revenues, the appropriations chairman in the House is on board saying we need revenues, the key is, from where? From where are you going to get those revenue dollars? And if they continue to try to nickel and dime our way out of a $900 million budget hole, we're going to find out that more budget cuts are coming. And what little money they do raise will come out of your pockets and the pockets of the people that live in Del City. And we're going to be right back here next year.
So why is it that every time they look to fill the budget hole, they immediately turn to the sales tax on something, which is the most regressive tax of all? Why not be honest about it, go with the income tax, which is the fairest tax of all,
Sure.
and take a look at corporate welfare?
Sure.
Why are they not willing to do that? And what's it going to take to persuade them to do the right thing?
The biggest obstacle at the state capitol, I find, is that we have too many of my colleagues with whom I work that would rather govern by political philosophy than by political reality. They fundamentally believe that if you just keep cutting the top income tax rate in the state of Oklahoma, that eventually it will come back. They will believe that to this day, even though they've got 6 years of looking at $1 billion worth of tax cuts and then $1 billion hole, right? They've got 6 years now, 6 years of looking at, 4 years of looking at the state of Kansas and watching what they've done, right? And they still continue to go, no, that philosophy works. If they're governing by political reality, they say, you don't cut taxes in January at a time when you're looking at a $1.3 billion budget hole. political reality alters your behavior, but they don't do that. They truly fundamentally believe it. And so the reason they go with a sales tax is because they don't care. I mean, that's not part of their ideology. They look at it and they will say, the mantra that you'll hear from my colleagues is, well, we want to make sure everybody's got skin in the game. If I've heard that one time, I've heard it 1,000 times. And a sales tax means everybody's got skin in the game because everybody's got to pay it. What they won't say is, including the 6-year-old at the 7-Eleven who buys a Twinkie, right? That little kid's paying it too. They don't talk about that. But they say everybody's got skin in the game, and that's their political philosophy. Is we'll cast it that way, and that way they get to turn around and believe that if you just eliminate the income tax, that's what's best for the state, and it also protects their corporate special interests that continue to write fat campaign checks to them, so they don't have to turn around and deal with tax credits or the gross production tax.
Do you get a sense with the numbers that the Republicans have in the supermajority that there might be, I think we all know that there are different factions operating within those large numbers on both sides of the building, but do you see opportunity perhaps in that divide there to work with certain groups to try to actually get some things done, or are they still at a point where they really won't consider doing anything that has Democratic fingerprints on it?
So the question I get from most people who pay attention to what I do is they'll say, "Why do you do this? Why?" Right? I don't get it, because you don't win very many battles. Most of your pieces of legislation don't get heard, let alone get passed out of the House or out of the Senate or even get to the governor's desk, right? What's the point? And there are two answers to that question. One is, my predecessor in the House of Representatives was a gentleman by the name of Kevin Calvey. And while Kevin Calvey was my Sunday school teacher, true story, if you know who Kevin Calvey is, Kevin Calvey and I could not be more diametrically opposed in temperament, in ideology, in philosophy, right? And I remind myself of that every day that I get up and I get frustrated because I lost another battle, I go, if I leave here, somebody like Kevin Calvey can take my place. And so therefore, when I'm fighting for the kids in the public school system, like my girls, right, I'd be handing that baton off potentially to somebody who's going the other direction. And so that keeps me motivated. But more importantly, even than that, is my job as minority leader is to try to build coalitions. And because the Republican caucus, and it was that way when the Democrats had supermajorities in the House, but because the Republican caucus can't get on the same page on some big issues, because you've got your far right flank, you've got a few moderates, there are not very many of them, but you got a few moderates, then you sort of have your traditional conservatives sort of in the middle, right? They fight each other all the time over some big issues. And so what we do is we sit back and I lock my caucus down. My caucus is in lockstep with me. We talk about it. I don't force their hand. My leadership team sits down and we discuss each specific issue, determine how we want to go, and then once we make that decision, we walk into caucus and say, we are nothing if we break, right? If 10 of us go this way and 15 of us go that way or whatever, we are worthless, right? So I make sure we stay locked down together, and we do that. We've done that great in my 6 years. And then what I do is I go find a way to either defeat bad legislation by teaming up with 25 or 30 House Republicans who are disaffected for whatever reason, or we get things passed. Make no mistake about it, when you listen to the governor's speech coming up here in a week from Monday, she's going to tout all these wonderful things she's done with criminal justice reform. She's going to, right? And I'll be honest with you, when she's done in 2 years, if she doesn't become ambassador of what's happening now, right? When she's done in 2 years, one of the maybe the only real highlight that she can look back on and say with pride, this is what I did, is criminal justice reform. You know how many Republicans voted for the biggest piece of criminal justice reform that was passed? About 35. Right? It takes 51 to pass a bill, right? The thing that the former Speaker of the House, Chris Steele, hung his hat on. It was his signature legislation. He was leaving. He was being term limited out in 2012, right? And he appointed me and a bunch of others, and we sat on this huge criminal justice reinvestment initiative panel, right? Studied it for a year. People from all over the state, from every background, mental health, DHS, corrections, law enforcement, you name it. We were there. We studied it forever and ever and ever. We put this huge package together. The governor said she supports it. Chris Steele, as the Speaker of the House, says he supports it, and he can only get about half his caucus to vote for it. If my caucus wanted to, we could have said, you know what, stick it in your eye. Right? You can't get it done, forget you. We're going to embarrass you, right? But my caucus believed fundamentally that the way we do criminal justice right now by locking up everybody and spending the kind of money we spend is not only fiscally irresponsible, but it's also destroying families and destroying futures. And so my caucus locked down together, and we passed criminal justice reform. The single greatest achievement of Governor Fallon's administration, I think when she's done, will be because House Democrats pushed her across the finish line, right? She won't say that, but it's because we did, right? So the way I stay motivated is I wait. You can't sometimes you play offense. Most of the time in my role, you play defense, or you let the game come to you, right? As somebody who likes sports, you let the game come to you, and I got to wait. And maybe it's late April, and all of a sudden you just make sure the team is together, and you find a chance to pass a bill or defeat a bill because they can't stay on the same page. That's how we become relevant. And any given year, there's 5 or 6 major pieces of legislation that don't become law or do become law because 25 or 30 House Democrats got it across the finish line when those Republicans couldn't get on the same page.
Okay, I went to the Senate Republicans unveiled their agenda today, which was essentially the same agenda that they've had every year that I can remember out there, but with very few specifics. But it is true that we have myriad teacher pay raise bills in the hopper at the Capitol. Do you really think, given the $900 million budget hole, that anything is going to happen? I hate to be so cynical and skeptical, but there's a lot of happiness. There's always a lot of pie in the sky in January, and when you get to the reality of May, it seems to just sort of vanish.
I think they did this last year where they rolled out 3 or 4 different teacher pay bills because they knew they were running into an election cycle in which education was a big deal. They'd had 2 years in a row in which we had thousands of teachers rallying at the state capitol, and so they said, well, we got to file a bunch of teacher pay bills so that way when I go run for re-election in my own race, I can at least tell them it's those bums that didn't get it passed. I filed it. Here's my bill, right? They do that a lot on both sides. But in that case, it was the House Republicans saying, oh, well, I've got a bill. And I came out and I said, Channel 4 interviewed me. You can go back and look it up. Channel 4 interviewed me and said, hey, Gene, and said, I said, it's not going to happen. There will be no pay raise. And David Holt, my counterpart on the other side of the aisle in the state Senate, he came up and said, that's just such negative thinking. I certainly would have much more hope that we can actually do it. Now, he had a $10,000 pay raise, mind you, that he was saying was going to get done last year. And I was saying, look, we got a $1.3 billion hole. $300 million to do a pay raise for teachers when you've decimated all the other agencies. As much as I love teachers, and they know that I do, it seems a little out of kilter to turn around and say, well, we're going to cut some more budgets by $300 million to give it all to teachers and let other people suffer, right? I said it's not going to happen, and we came to the end of session, and it didn't happen, right? Now there's 10 times as many teacher pay bills as they had last year, all because they're trying to say that they're going to get it done. I think there's a chance that they'll find a way to do a $1,000 pay raise of some sorts. But the devil's in the details. The point man on the teacher pay raise bill in the Oklahoma House of Representatives is a Republican by the name of Mike Rogers, who's a state representative from Broken Arrow. He's the one who last year offered up his teacher pay plan, which was going to cap teacher health benefits, right? And use the money there to pay teachers a salary. So in other words, I'm going to take it out of your right pocket, and I'm going to put it in your left pocket, and you write me a thank you note, right? That was his idea. And oh, by the way, when I take it out of your right pocket and put it in your left pocket, you're going to tax what's in your left pocket, not what's in your right pocket. But you really need to thank me for it. And we defeated that. That got nowhere, right? But he's the same guy that's come back. Now, he's offered up a plan that's going to do a $1,000 pay raise the first year, a $2,000 the second year, and a $3,000 the next year, right? You know what he hasn't offered up is how he's going to pay for it. Last year, he rolled his plan out with how he's going to pay for it, and that thing was dead within 24 hours, right? Everybody got calls, I got calls, he got the heat, and he said, I'm pulling it, I'm sorry, right? This year, he learned his lesson. Throw it out there. Make everybody think there's a chance, and don't give them the details. I don't know how they pay for it, Arnold. I have no idea how they pay for it, unless they're going to find new revenues, which we've already talked about, what those new revenues would look like. And so right now, if I were a betting man, I'd say that the likelihood of getting a legitimate, significant teacher pay raise passed has got to be pretty slim.
Well, I know that the Republican majority has talked ad nauseum about local control over the years, and they'll continue to do so now, although we see plans out there that would cap superintendents' salaries based on school population. And I'm just curious how that would square with the notion of local control when localities are the ones that decide what they're going to pay their superintendents, for example. And what does that do to areas that maybe are struggling in Oklahoma if all of a sudden you're limited in what you could pay a superintendent to get them to come in? And
Arnold, you're going to be shocked to find out that some politicians are hypocritical.
Oh.
I'm sorry to say that, but it's true, right? So they believe in, they will throw rocks at the former administration now, I guess. They throw rocks at the former administration and say that they're trying to take too much power away from the states. But then, because what they do in Washington is not local enough for what happens at 23rd and Lincoln, I'll be honest with you, on the whole, I agree with that, right? But then apparently 23rd and Lincoln is close enough to local for Bug Tussle and McAllister and Goody Bowen and Guyman and the rest of them, because they'll run it all out of there just fine, right? It's not local control, it's their control, right? That's the difference. And they have Senator Smalley from Stroud offered up legislation to cap superintendent salaries, right? Because the sort of argument du jour, it has been for years, it's not even du jour, I guess, the argument they've used over and over and over again is, we're not going to do any real resources to teacher pay or any real resources to public schools until we get this superintendent thing taken care of, right? Understand, if you consolidated all the superintendents down, you went to one per county except for like Cleveland, Oklahoma, Tulsa, and Comanche or something like that, right? If you did that, you'd save, multiple millions of dollars. But out of a $3 billion budget, it is just a drop in the bucket, right? It doesn't do anything. It doesn't really save the significant amount of money that it would take to do a teacher pay raise or something else. And they also know it's almost politically impossible. Remember, they now have 75 Republicans in the House of Representatives, right? It only takes 51 to go to a county superintendent. They could do it tomorrow, Monday, right? They could do it. They've never done it because they know they go back home and they get run out on a rail when they look like they're trying to consolidate rural schools, right? So what they do is they offer that excuse and say, until we get our superintendent salaries down or until we consolidate school superintendents, we're not going to invest any more money. Well, then that means they're never going to invest any more money. They could do it on their own right now. So then they offer up this thing because it sounds good to say, let's cap superintendent salaries. For those of you who don't know, there's already a law in the books that says school districts can't spend more than 4% of their resources on administrative costs, right? All administrative costs, not just on a superintendent, but all administrative costs. We already cap it. The average right now is at about 3.7%, right, per district. So it's already capped. Here's the offensive part, and I told Senator Smalley, he's a friend of mine. The offensive part isn't just the local control part, right? Taking the local control away from the local school board. But the offensive part is looking at those school board members, like the ones I have in Mid-Del. I've got a police officer, a CPA, an attorney, and then two former principals, right? Who they make the decision as what's best for my kids. What superintendent they should hire, how much money they ought to offer in order to get that superintendent to come, right? They make those decisions. They're smart people who've got a budget, and I trust them. What Senator Smalley is saying is, I don't trust those folks. I don't trust those folks to make the right decision as to how much that man or woman should get paid. I don't think it's going to go anywhere. I think there's enough of us who believe in local control to be able to push back on that. But it's another argument. It's sort of a red herring. They throw it out there and go, why do we need to put more money in the school funding formula when you've got a superintendent making $90,000 in some rural town? And they never mention, well, that superintendent also drives the bus, he also teaches a class, also coaches basketball. That stuff's immaterial to the overall argument, right? They just like to say, can you believe it? The average person in Major County makes $28,000 a year and the superintendent gets paid $90,000. Right? And they try to make that seem like it's some sort of outrage. They don't really talk apples and apples, and it's their way to distract attention away from the real problem, which is we're underfunding our public schools to the point now where we're down about $225 per pupil, right, across the state. There are 2,000 fewer teachers in the school system statewide today than there were just a couple of years ago, while we have about 60,000+ new students in the system. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle love to say we need to run government or our public schools like a business, right? I love to look at them and say, fine, right? Give me 27% of your operating budget, sir, ma'am, that run your business. Give me 2,000 of your employees, and I'm going to give you 60,000 new customers to serve, and you go get better. It won't work. They know that. But that's exactly what they ask of our public schools, and it's not working. And it's not the teacher's fault or the student's fault or the parent's fault or the administrator's fault. It's the fact that we put 30, 35 kids in a classroom when we don't give them the money they need to hire the right teachers and the right staff.
Let's throw it open to the floor. I think we're about a half hour into this, so Bill, you're up first.
I hate to rain on somebody's parade.
Go ahead, Bill.
But all I've heard from Washington is let's turn this over to the states. And this is true during the congressional hearings in terms of people taking the cabinet positions. This is true in terms of the president's outline. This is tidal wave coming in the state of Oklahoma, in addition to the underwater you're already dealing with. There's some movement afoot that are going to take a couple of years to begin to address the problem, like the elimination of state question, or overturning state question 640 and getting it down to where it's realistic. Your comments?
I will say, going back to you mentioned right at the end state question 640. For those who don't know, state question 640 passed in 1992 as a response to Governor Bellman and then Speaker Lewis's House Bill 1017, which was a big tax increase and a reduction of class sizes and a teacher pay raise and all those great things in 1990. And then after that, they passed State Question 640 that says you can no longer raise taxes in the state of Oklahoma without either a vote of the people or without a supermajority in the House and the Senate, which is 76 votes. Since 1992, there's not been a tax increase in the Oklahoma legislature. Right? Has not happened. And that is certainly hamstring. It takes 51 votes to cut a tax and takes 76 to raise them. And therein lies a huge problem. To your point, though, talking about putting stuff on the ballot, you kind of addressed that. I do think that folks of my political persuasion, I'm not going to lump you all in with me because you may not want to be, but folks of my political persuasion, I'm certainly talking with people who have the resources and the wherewithal to take on some of the challenges like redistricting reform, like minimum wage reform, and some other things, and saying if we're really going to do those, we need to do those on the ballot. And as evidence that it will work, you go to the state of Arkansas, who just 2 years ago, when a conservative state of Arkansas threw out Mark Pryor, whose father and he had been a political powerhouse in the state of Arkansas for generations. They threw him on his tail, and at the same night they threw him on his tail, 67% of them voted to increase the minimum wage in Arkansas. That wouldn't seem to line up, but it did. And so at times when you look back and go, boy, what are the voters thinking? Sometimes they'll do the right thing. And I think that if we're really going to change the state now, we need to take two tacks. We need to look at ballot initiatives, right? And you also need to look at the chief executive. I think that if you go back and look at what Frank Keating did when he was governor from 1994 until he left in 2002, Frank Keating never had a Republican majority. Never, right? But Frank Keating never had a veto overridden either. Right? What Frank Keating wanted, by and large, Frank Keating got, because he knew he could tell the Democratic Speaker and the Democratic Pro Tem in the Senate, if you don't give me what I want, I'll veto it, and I've got enough votes in the House or the Senate to sustain it. And he did that. What I try to do is I instill a little bit of hope and optimism in folks who believe like I do is this. There's 26 Democrats in the House of Representatives. It takes 34 to sustain the veto, right? I think there's a chance that we can march back. I think Donald Trump may turn out to be the best thing that's happened to Oklahoma Democrats in a long time. Oddly enough, I do, right? And I think there's a chance that in 2 years, if we litigate the case correctly, and do sort of a Ronald Reagan, Jimmy Carter redux, are you better off today than you were 8 years ago? Everybody's going to go, no. Well, then why don't you give us why don't you give a Democrat a chance? I think there's a chance to elect a Democrat in 2 years to the governor's mansion, and as we get back to 34, if we can do that, we're back in the ballgame. You don't have to get to 51 and 25, right? You got to have a governor, and you got to have 34 in the House, and if you could do that, when they run bad bills that are either horrible social legislation or bad tax cuts, you veto them, they sustain them, you kick them back, right? I think we can do that. So we got to do the ballot initiative method, and you got to turn around and try to get a chief executive elected along with about 8 more Democrats in the House. It's going to be very difficult in this environment, but I promise you today it is easier, as sad as it is to say, it's easier today than it would be if Hillary Clinton were in the White House, and we've got to take advantage of it because the Republicans across the nation in 2010 took advantage of the backlash, and they took over legislatures like crazy, they took over governor's mansions, and then they redistricted the fire out of everything, and they have entrenched themselves. So what we have to do, those of us who believe like I do, is you got to win now. We got to use the anti-Trump wave in 2 years to start winning some governor's mansions back, and hopefully have enough so that way come 2020 and 2021, when everybody redraws the lines, we can correct the egregious mistakes that the folks in charge currently make. That's sort of my plan.
Dr. Cobb, the superintendent of Middale Schools, has a wonderful blog. And yesterday he posted that he planned to be here tonight to listen to you, but he saw that there was also an event in Chickasha, I believe, at USAO about school vouchers.
That's right.
And probably most of us know there's not going to be a teacher pay raise of any merit, but I am more concerned at this point about vouchers and school choice and all, whatever name they want to give it this time around. Where's that going to go, do you think?
I still think we have the votes to defeat a voucher bill, a straight-out voucher bill. I think we still have the votes, but every year that goes by, we get closer and closer to its final passage, right? To where they'll finally get what they want. I think we have the votes to defeat it now. Lieutenant Governor Lamb is going to, I think he may be at that event tonight. I know he's a big fan of the voucher program. And they're out there pushing it hard. They're trying desperately to get enough Republicans in the House of Representatives to support it. In my opinion, it's not my opinion, it's fact. I've gone back. Stanford did a study a number of years ago, and they looked at Cleveland, Milwaukee, Detroit, some of the places that implemented some voucher programs that they said they were going to be good for inner city schools. And by and large, every one of those showed either no improvement or poor improvement, right? On average, a student who took advantage from an inner city school who left in Milwaukee, for example, if they got a voucher and were able to have enough money to make up the difference, right, between what the voucher was and whatever the private school cost them, and have the resources or a parent to get them there, about a 33% chance that that student was going to do better than what they did in the public school, right? But about a 33% chance that they would do worse, and about a 33% chance that they'd stay right the same. So I look at it and go, we're going to expend all these dollars. In Indiana, for example, under Mike Pence, they spent about $360 million that have been siphoned off of Indiana public schools to go into voucher programs to for-profit schools or for private schools, right? If you take that $360 million out of the Oklahoma public schools today, we're already bankrupt, right? We can't afford it. And I will argue that not only do the numbers show that it doesn't work, just common sense shows that it won't work. The same Republicans that I deal with will say that we want to create competition among schools, and that's how we're going to do it like businesses do. I go right back to them. A public school system, if you go to Mid-Del like where I am today, or my district is, if you go to Del City High School, if you can find a kid who has the resources, has a car to get them to where they got to go, right? And who can make up the difference between the $2,000 or $3,000 voucher they might get and the $5,000 or $6,000 or $7,000 or $8,000 tuition they might cost them at a private school. So now you're talking about a very select group of people, right? If you can find those folks, odds are their parents are more involved in their lives. They're probably better students. They probably stay out of trouble more often, right? That's just the nature of somebody in that demographic, right? So you take those few kids out, you leave everybody else behind. What have you done? You've weakened the classroom because you've taken some potential leaders out of the classroom, right? You've taken dollars out of the classroom that were used to pay that teacher's salary. And that teacher's still got to teach. Whether there's 26 or 24, that teacher's still got to be there. Now you got 2 fewer kids, which means the dollars go with the kid, right? So you have fewer dollars to keep the classroom open. And then you're telling folks that they're somehow supposed to get better, right? It's if I went to you and I went to your employees and I took 5 of your best employees and the money that you used to pay them and I gave them to your competitor and I said, now get better. It doesn't work. It won't work in the voucher field either, and we have got to have enough of us in the education community, support the education community, to push back on them, because once they get that done, just like in other states, they get their foot in the door, they say because they really care about inner city schools. Right? My argument is if you care about inner city schools, why don't you go in there and do something about poverty? That's expensive, they don't want to do that. I sit next to Senator Standridge, who's my state senator in Mid-Del today. And he castigated me in front of the whole Mid-Del crowd. It was not his room, so it didn't really matter. They were with me. But he castigated me for saying, how dare you talk about some kid who's a minority kid or some kid who's poor. He goes, as a businessman, I don't look and ask, were you poor? I don't care what the skin color is. I don't care anything. I just care whether or not you can do the job. And I came back and said, Senator, you got it all wrong. I'm not talking about the kid I'm not talking about the 25-year-old or the 30-year-old walking in for the job. I want to make sure that the 25-year-old kid, when he gets there, had the education he needed to actually walk in the room. And right now, it's not the case. He believes, and he said it, everybody ought to be able to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. And I said, Senator, I get that. But some folks have alligator bootstraps, and some kids can't even afford boots. And until you can give them the boots they need, they can't pull themselves up. But that is the mentality that those folks have, and you got to push back on it, because if they finally do get their foot in the door by using inner city schools as the excuse, their ultimate goal is to just open it wide and say any kid who may already be at Bishop McGinnis, and as a guy who grew up Catholic with Frosty Troy, and my dad grew up at St. Philip Neri there in Midwest City. I get Catholic schools. My dad went to a Catholic school before he went to Del City High School, right? I get all that. But the worst thing that could ever happen to us is to look at all those kids that are currently in private schools and go, all you got to do now is fill out the form and you'll get your tax dollars to come over to you. It will bankrupt public schools, and they're already in such a state of crisis. So.
I do want to point out, it's interesting today that with the Republican Senate agenda that was unveiled, not a word about vouchers or anything like that. And Senator Smalley was asked specifically about that at the press conference. And he basically said the focus needs to be on teacher pay. We need to deal with that. But he kept talking about this is really a national effort. This is a national effort that's ongoing. It's a national effort, almost like, well, these are the outsiders agitating, but we're going to focus on teacher pay. So we'll see what that means, if anything. What else? Over here. Yeah.
Cigarette tax last year, cigarette tax this year.
Sure. So last year, the cigarette, for those of you who were at the OPI thing, you saw a show today, but I got fired up over it. So for those of you who didn't follow the cigarette tax debate last year, the governor came out and said she wanted to increase the tax on cigarettes by $1.50 a pack. It would bring about $150 to $170 million into the state, right? That was her plan, but it was as part of an overall health care plan. For the last 6 years, my caucus has called for the expansion of Medicaid, bring those $900 million home, cover those folks who are uninsured. Right now, hospitals, we've had 9 or 10 hospitals in the last 6 years in Oklahoma file for bankruptcy. My argument to the governor and everybody else is they didn't file for bankruptcy because cigarettes were too cheap. They filed for bankruptcy because we have too many people who are uninsured, who walk in and get coverage and walk out and don't pay for it, and they have no way to get compensated, right? And so finally, for the first 5 or 6 years, the governor said we can't afford Medicaid expansion because we have no way to pay for it, right? Because on the outlying year, it would cost us about 10% of the overall cost, which could be between $60 to $80 million, right? She said we can't afford it, so we're not going to expand it. Nico Gomez, who at the time was the head of the Oklahoma Healthcare Authority, he put a plan together and said, hey, we will expand Medicaid, put them on Insure Oklahoma, but essentially take the expansion of Medicaid dollars, put them on Insure Oklahoma, and we'll raise a cigarette tax to get it done. Right? He came to me, he said, would you do that? I said, it's a great idea. Right? I'm not necessarily a huge fan of raising taxes on cigarettes, but if you use those dollars to bring Medicaid dollars home, then you help reduce a little bit of smoking, and you've got $900 million to cover the uninsured. It's a wonderful idea. The governor said she was for it. The Speaker of the House was relatively for it. My caucus was for it. The Senate Democrats were for it. And for a while, the Senate Republicans were for it. And then, about 3 or 4 days before we got ready to launch it, and it was going to be, we were going to do the cigarette tax in the House first, and the Senate was going to do the Insure Oklahoma expansion in the Senate, and then we would come over and we'd have to trust each other that to pass it the right way. That was the whole plan. I'd worked it out with President Bingman and worked it out with Senator Jolly and Senator Treat. About 3 or 4 days before all that stuff was to come out, I got a phone call, and it was Clark Jolly, and he said, come to my office. I said, okay, I'm coming. Well, see, in those 3 or 4 days beforehand, Tom Colbert and OCPA, the Oklahoma Council of Public Affairs, a right-wing think tank in the state, they came out. They heard that we were close to cutting the deal, right? They came out and said, we hear that they're looking to expand Insure Oklahoma. We want everybody to know that if they expand Insure Oklahoma, it's just Medicaid expansion by another name, and any Republican who votes for it will have to pay the price at the polls, right? That's what they said, Colbert and OCPA. So I get a call from Clark Jolly. I go into his office, and he looks at me and says, Leader Inman, we got a problem. And I said, Senator Jolly, what's the problem? He says, my caucus will not support the Insure Oklahoma expansion. I go, why? I said, I only need 16 of you. It takes a supermajority to pass a tax. It only takes 25 senators to do the Insure Oklahoma expansion. I had 9 Democrats in the Senate at the time. We're locked down together. I said, I don't need 16 of you. You don't have 16 of 39 Republicans who will do the Insure Oklahoma expansion. We'll do a cigarette tax. It'll be $1 billion+ for health care in Oklahoma, right? He said, we're not going to do it. We won't do it. My members won't do it. He said, but give me the cigarette tax anyway. I need your votes on the cigarette tax. And I said, I can't do it. I said, I won't do it. I won't do it. He says, oh, but it'll help with the dollars. It'll bring some money in, and we'll prevent cuts to the health care authority and all that. You've got to do it. And I said, I will not. I said, we're as close as we've ever been to unlocking the key. Again, I told him, we're here not because cigarettes are too cheap. We're here because you guys won't cover the uninsured. And this is the way to do it. And I said, if I give you the cigarette tax today, then when I come back next year and say, because I thought Hillary was going to win. So when I come back next year, didn't we all? But I thought I'd come back next year and say, let's expand Medicaid. You'll say, well, how are you going to pay for it, Leader Inman? And I would have nothing, because that $150 million would have been absorbed into the budget, and we'd have been left holding the bag. And so my caucus stood on our principles, right? And we said, we're not going to vote for it. And it failed, in part because of us, right? I looked at the governor today, and she gave me some guff in the meeting today that we had in her office. And she said, well, I really wish you would have voted for that. And I said, I really wish you would have gotten 16 Senate Republicans to do your plan, Governor. It was her plan, not Scott Inman's plan, right? My plan was just to expand Medicaid. Her plan was to put them on Insure Oklahoma, which would require co-pays and all these other things. And I said, I'm willing to support it. I even told Governor Fallon last year, I'll stand right next to you at the press conference and say, this is not what I wanted. If that's what it takes to get Republicans to vote for it. I'll say, this is not what I wanted. And she said, do you really do that? And I said, yes, ma'am, I will absolutely do that. True story. And I said, I'll say whatever you want to say, right? Just get it done. And so I told her again this year, if you'll do it now, she said, well, I don't know what Trump's going to do. And I said, none of us do. But I said, if you're willing to do it again this year, my caucus will give you the cigarette tax if you can expand Insure Oklahoma and bring those dollars home and cover those folks. In the meantime, we've had two more hospitals file for bankruptcy. Other hospitals are going to outpatient-only facilities, right? And those of us who live in the city, it seems like to not affect us, right? But if you live in Frederick, or if you live in Sayre, oh my goodness, right? That's huge. You got to go someplace else to have a surgery. If you're going to have a baby, you got to go someplace else. And this is the part that I argue with my conservative colleagues who are all pro-business. And not that I'm not. I go, you understand that there are some industries in the state of Oklahoma, in the country, that by their own insurance policies, if they can't do their construction work, or they can't do their mining work, or whatever it is, unless they're within X number of miles of an emergency room, right? They have to, for their insurance policies, right? If you shut these rural hospitals down, you are shutting off certain industries to certain parts of the state. It's bad for business, right? And they still won't do it right. And so I took a lot of heat. I took heat today from Ken Miller and Leslie Osborne at that panel. I took heat from the governor today. But I'll stand on my principles and say, all I asked for was the governor to honor her own commitment. She didn't do it, and I'll be dadgum if they're going to sit there and make me pass their bill when they wouldn't even do what was right by their own standards.
Yeah, way back to the back. Yeah, hang.
I just want to say, I wish you were my representative.
So, where do you live? Who's your?
I live in Yukon.
So is it John Paul Jordan or Leslie?
It's Jordan.
Well, let's all say a prayer for him.
Okay, go ahead.
My question is,
Oh.
I just want to have some more light on the Dan Kirby
Yeah.
incident. I know it's still
How much you want to know?
and I want to know why he was allowed to keep his seat.
Yeah.
He resigned.
It's a great question. So the question was, he wants a little more light shed on the Dan Kirby fiasco, right? So Representative Kirby, representative from Republican representative from Tulsa, sexually harassed multiple women. Allegedly, as an attorney, we always say allegedly to kind of CYA, really. But I'll be honest with you, I've heard of the text messages. I've seen some of the things. I mean, it's a foregone conclusion. What Representative Kirby did was reprehensible. He never should have done it to anybody, let alone somebody who was working for him. And what happened there was Speaker Hickman, and it's my understanding that there are other folks involved, current members of the leadership team. Speaker Hickman's gone, but there are current members of this existing leadership team who are all in the room. We're trying to get to the bottom of it. I'm to the bottom of it. I'm not willing to say it publicly yet because I want that out. But I want somebody else to flesh that out. But there are other members of the current leadership team that were in that room saying, we got to make this go away. We got to make this go away. Let's pay the money. About $70,000 of your taxpayer dollars. So about 2 teachers' salaries, right? About $70,000 of your taxpayer dollars was used as hush money to try to make it go away. And they were told, we got to do this in the last couple of days of Hickman's administration, so that way the settlement didn't fall into the lap of Speaker McCall. They wanted to make sure that didn't happen. They spent that money and then hid some of it under the items of housekeeping and cleaning supplies, right? They put the attorney's fees for the young lady's attorney under the category of housekeeping and cleaning supplies as a way to try to hide it. I fundamentally believe that what they did is illegal. And once we get this House Star Chamber Committee, whatever's going on, that they won't let anything out. Once we get that thing done, my caucus is going to pursue some legal remedies, and we're going to be taking some things to the district attorney because I believe what they did, how they spent it, how they hid it, the decisions that were made were illegal. And so not only does Representative Kirby need to account for his misdeeds, but the folks who covered it up and I think illegally spent state tax dollars need to pay for theirs as well.
Yeah, well over here.
I just want to say thank you for your willingness to push forward progressive baptism mechanisms, because I know it's really frustrating, so I appreciate your willingness to do that. But I'm curious about the current dialogue at the Capitol building about the incarceration rate and how you contribute to that.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's one that earlier I talked about, the criminal justice reform that we've done. We're moving in the right direction, right? Absolutely. We've finally gotten right on that issue in terms of sentencing reform, in terms of trying to utilize drug courts, trying to make sure that if you get caught with marijuana in your back pocket, you're not going to jail for the next 10 years, those kinds of things. So we've worked on some of those. The issue with that, though, is this. None of it is retrospective, right? So our prisons are chock full. We incarcerate more women per capita than any other state in the nation, right? And men were like 3rd or 4th. It's really high, right? It's really bad. And they're chock full. We can't go back and go, you get to go home, you get to go home, you get to go home, we don't do that, right? So what we have to do is we have to start today and move forward. This is the irony of it, right? So I'm a student of history, thanks to some of the people in the room. We are today living with Frank Keating's bad decisions, right? It was Frank Keating who came in and said, we want truth in sentencing, we're going to lock everybody up. We need 85% crimes, everybody needs to serve 85% of their crime, or their time. Lock them up, lock them up, lock them up. And Frank Keating started that in 1994 and moved on through, right? Now, granted, it was Democratic legislatures that passed them as well, through some sort of compromise. So it's not just one party, but it was Frank Keating's plan. He said that's what he believed in. Well, it's taken 20 years to get us chock full, right? But if you look at the state of Texas with their criminal justice reform, they've closed prisons, right? They've shut them down because they don't have the need for them. So my hope is, if we can implement the reforms and let them take effect, that in the next 10 to 15 years you'll start to see some real change. My fear, though, is this. Just like I'm afraid that every new House Republican that gets elected who runs on a platform of abortion, guns, and cutting taxes, right? I don't think that you're going to get a House Republican that's going to run 12 years and never vote for a tax increase, a tax cut, right? They're going to try to fight. That's what they run on, right? So my fear is that even if you have some folks in this environment that are like, okay, we don't need to be cutting any more taxes. Well, in 2 or 4 years, term limits means I'm gone, somebody else is gone, and they're going, hey, I've been around here 6 years and I'm not voting for a tax cut. Let's do one of those, right? That's going to happen. Same thing on criminal justice reform. My fear is all it takes is somebody to go, by gosh, we need to be tough on that guy, or tough on somebody who does X, and it sells really well, and they pass it. They pass the law because who's going to vote against being tough on people who use illegal drugs or who hurt people or whatever, right? Everybody wants to be tough on crime instead of being smart on crime. Well, once we do that, then you can, within one session, you could undo the years of work that we put into criminal justice reform. And my hope is that you've got enough leadership, whether it's with Governor Fallon for the next 2 years, and I think she will push back on some of those efforts because she fundamentally believes in criminal justice reform. And then whomever gets elected governor in 2018, for the 4 years or 8 years that he or she is there, hopefully they'll have the opportunity to push back and let these reforms take effect. If not, all of this was a lot of window dressing and looked good and turned out for nothing. No real savings are realized.
Alec, you had your hand up over here.
Do you think there's enough public sentiment in the state to repeal the inability to raise taxes?
No. No, I don't. I think if you put it on the ballot and try to take it away, it won't. I do think, even though the state question for the 1 cent sales tax for teacher pay raises went down, I do think there's an opportunity to put a particular revenue-raising measure, a tax increase, as it were, for a specific item, and you can get that passed, right? I think the reason this failed was in large part because it had some higher ed stuff attached to it and some other things that helped to take it down. But the city of Oklahoma City has demonstrated to all of us that if you go out and tell citizens, I'm going to raise your taxes, but I'm going to do it for this reason. I'm going to spend it here, here, and here. Voters get it, right? I try to preach that to my Republican colleagues who say, oh, voters don't like paying taxes. I go, no, they don't like paying taxes that get wasted, or they don't know where it goes, right? But if you can demonstrate, go for example, look at bond proposals. Most bond proposals pass as a tax increase, right? They pass because they know they're going to build a new building, they're going to build a new library, something, right? Same thing here. I think that where we're going to have to be, going back to what Bill said, the question I responded to with Bill, I think those of us who care about trying to find revenues, they're going to nickel and dime our way to death in the legislature. If we really want to tweak some things, it'll have to be a MAP-style tax for the state. We're going to do a 0.25% income tax increase, and it's going to be earmarked for X, whatever. And if you do that, I do think there's an appetite to raise revenue. But if you just come in and do, I think the two things that have hurt the state the most, outside of redistricting, the two things that have hurt the state the most are term limits and State Question 640, right? And the idea of getting voters to eliminate term limits or eliminate 640, hold your breath. It's not going to happen. Yes.
How do you feel about the many spots that ran unopposed in the last couple of cycles?
Yeah.
It sort of surprises me with the strong sentiment that sort of came out during the Women's March and during other things that there are so many people who won't run. And how do you feel about that?
Yeah, so as minority leader, one of my jobs isn't just to do things like this and fight the fight. One of them is one of my jobs is to go out and recruit candidates, right? And although I will, for those of you who like baseball, I'm a big baseball fan, a big St. Louis Cardinals fan, and I liken my job to that of the general manager of the House Democratic Caucus. And the Speaker of the House will be the general manager of the House Republican Caucus, right? And so when I go out to recruit a candidate, I got to go find somebody who can hit a major league fastball, right? Somebody just the best candidate, got the best connections in that district, knows everybody, can get elected regardless of the fact that they're a Democrat, and can hit a major league fastball. And the Speaker has to go find somebody who can hit a ball off a tee, right? That's about it. In Oklahoma, I'm a Republican, you just put it down and go. And there's a lot of very nice people with whom I work, right? But I ask myself often, how? How did you get here? Right? I mean, what I understand, right? Did you knock on doors? I mean, sometimes there's some candidates that, generally speaking, you want people to go out and knock doors because they earn votes. Sometimes there's some Republican candidates that I would encourage, please go knock as many doors as you can. Let everybody see you. And they win anyway, right? This cycle, though, was different. 2 cycles ago, right? So 6 years ago, or 4 years ago, as it were, the 2012, 14, 16. So the 2012 cycle, of the 101 House seats that we had, we only had 47 seats to have candidates file in them. That included all of our incumbents, and then just a handful of challengers. We didn't even have 51. So on the day of filing, in May at the time, or June, I guess at that time, in June, they already had their majority locked up. We couldn't take it away from them, right? 47 seats. 2014 comes around, we had about 55, 56 seats. So we were able to get over that hurdle where they couldn't claim the majority without the election, but they were going to get it, right? This year, 83 seats of the 101 had Democratic candidates in it, right? Now, a few of them got challenged, and it kind of whittled down to in the high 70s, right? But on filing day, the last day of filing, there were 83 of the 101, right? And a lot of those folks, God bless them, they were in seats that we couldn't win, right? We couldn't do it. But they said, I'm going to make that son of a gun earn it. I'm going to make them go out and talk about their record on education funding and tax cuts and health care and everything else. And they made them earn it. And they did earn it by all measures. They went out and won those elections, right? But it's important. It's important that people who care are willing to go put your name on the ballot and go take the arrows and take the heat and go knock on doors, because at the very least, A, you make them earn it, right? You make them spend money in a race that they otherwise wouldn't have spent money in, right? But here's the other thing, too. When I got elected in 2006, we flipped 4 Republican seats to Democratic seats. My seat, Representative Eric Proctor beat a 10-year incumbent in Mark Leota, right? Wallace Collins beat Thad Bachman, who had been a 4-year incumbent. Wallace went down there and beat him in that year. And Ken Luttrell won in Ponca City. I don't know how many of you have been to Ponca City. There aren't very many Democrats in K County, right? But Ken Luttrell won in Ponca City. If Ken hadn't signed up that year and said, I'm going to go knock doors, Ken was a greeter at Walmart in Ponca City. Okay, and won that race. Now, 4 years later, they knocked him off because the anti-Obama wave hit him and took him out, right? But he won that race. If he hadn't signed up and gone to knock doors and tried, there was no shot of us ever winning that. And so I firmly believe in 2018 and in 2020, with Trump still around, I don't think he'll get past 2020, but if in 2018 or 2020, we need to fill as many of those seats as possible, because I think we're going to luck into a few, because I think some Republicans and even some conservative Democrats who may have been voting for Republicans are going to be fed up with what's going on. And historically, trends, look at it this way. 13 of the last 15 governors in the state of Oklahoma have been won by the party out of power in the White House, right? Bill Clinton wins in 1992 and Keating wins in 94. George Bush wins in 2000. Brad Henry wins in 2002. Barack Obama wins in 8 and Fallon wins in 10, right? That's just how it works. There's always a kickback. And I think we're in for that, and we need to make sure we fill as many of those seats as possible, because I have hope that the folks who are really angry, and they are, I mean, your citizens, the folks you live with are mad about what's going on. Unfortunately, they empowered the folks in charge by 4 more seats in the House and 3 in the Senate, right? I don't chalk that up to them looking at what's going on at 23rd and Lincoln and saying, I want to give them more power. I chalk that up to they didn't like Hillary Clinton, they loved Donald Trump, right? Well, now, and I told Mary Fallon this to her face today, I said, you won't have Dick Nixon to kick around anymore, right? You won't have Barack Obama to kick around anymore. And I said, if you think that all of this stuff that's gone on, that she's been able to get cover from, because she could always point to Washington and blame the boogeyman in Washington, and they would look away, I said, it's over now, right? You guys run the show, and there will be a price to pay unless they fix it. And let's be honest, we've seen them for 6 years. They ain't going to fix it.
We have time for one more. Bill, I think you raised yours. And
why can't they tie the Oklahoma tax system directly into the federal system? Other states are doing it. Why can't Oklahoma?
What about this Republican legislature makes you think that they would want to do anything that they do in Washington? Nothing. It won't happen. It just won't. And I'll answer that quickly and maybe give one more
okay,
question.
one more over here. Oh, yeah, Nick.
Yeah, I had a question. How do you think the budget, we're going to really pay for government this year? What's your best guess?
Sure.
Answer in Spanish if you like.
Yeah. Decirlo en español, ¿verdad? No. It is funny, though, when I walk into some place and they look at the white guy with no hair and all of a sudden I start speaking Spanish, they look at me like, what in the world, who is that? But and it's all thanks to her. But they're going to pay for the budget the way they've paid for it the last 5 or 6 years. Last year, there were $500 million worth of one-time money, right? So they had a big budget hole. They raised a few dollars of revenue money. Then they sweep this revolving fund. They sweep that kitty from here and there. What they do oftentimes, they'll go to an agency and say, well, you've got a revolving fund of X amount of dollars that's really supposed to be used for this purpose. They'll say, we're going to grant you access to use it to pay for operating expenses, right? That's what they do. And so they'll find more one-time dollars. They've done it every year for the last 4 or 5 years. Well, the problem is a lot of those are recurring. Here's the difference, right? They're fees. A lot of them are fees that are paid for a service, right? Which we have argued that when you take, for example, if you're in the wildlife department and you pay a fee for your hunting license, if they sweep that fee and use that money for anything other than to administer the hunting license or run the wildlife department, that becomes a tax, in my opinion. The way I view it with my legal background, not that great, but I think it's a tax. I think it's illegal. I think it's unconstitutional for them to do that. But they do it all the time. And so some of these that are one-time funds are because they're not generally set to come into the general revenue fund. They do reoccur in the sense that some of those accounts that have fees, some of that money comes back and they'll go back and sweep them again. Does that make sense? So they're not set automatically go to GR. They are set to reoccur wherever they do happen, and they'll sweep them the best they can. And we don't have any money in the rainy day fund, so we're broke there. But yeah, they're going to do it that way, and they'll cut the budget. What's that?
Tobacco tax money, they're gonna tax it.
They'll try to do that, but they're going to do bonds. Last year they did $200 million worth of bond proposals. The governor told me today she's got another bond package that's coming out, and so so in other words, they'll do what you tell all of your kids and grandkids and everybody else not to do. It's like, hey, listen, if you've got something really important you got to pay for, don't put it on a credit card, right? That's what we do. The governor takes out the state's credit card and goes, we can't afford to raise the revenue. We don't want to take the tough votes, so let's just put it on a credit card. $200-300 million a year on a bond, on a credit card. We'll use that money to pay for whatever expenses that need to be paid. And oh, by the way, in 2 years, she'll be term limited out. She'll leave the fire burning for somebody else. The current leadership will be done in 2 or 4 years. They'll leave that fire burning for someplace else. Make no mistake about it, not only has term limits caused us to lose the institutional memory of the body, not only has it caused us to allow lobbyists and special interest groups to take over power because they can wait out a chairman now. They go, you're only going to be chairman for 2 years, and I'll go wine and dine the new young pup and get him or her in my back pocket. So that's sort of bastardized the process. But what it's also done is it has allowed for it has allowed for legislators like me and others to make decisions today that we never have to live under. Right? You want to vote for a tax cut today, get you elected for a couple of years. By the time the tax cut really hurts, I'm out. Somebody else has got to deal with it, right? It's a horrible system. A horrible system.
Arnold, I have one.
Okay, one more here
And
real
I'll
quick.
stay as long as Arnold will let me stay. I've got my kids will run me out of here. But
Are you a potential governor's candidate?
say that again.
Are you going to run for governor in 2 years?
Am I going to run for governor in 2 years?
One list.
You have to ask my wife. You have to ask my wife. But she and I have talked about it, and I've talked about it a lot. I spent the better part of the last year plus going around the state to all these different towns, meeting with the folks, community leaders and business leaders and political leaders all over the state with the idea that we might do that. I'm term limited out in 2018 at the same time that Governor Fallon is, and so I will have spent 8 years as minority leader. My sort of trajectory will put me in a place like that, and hopefully in the next 3 or 4 months we'll make that decision, but we're giving it strong consideration.
Good.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you. Thank you, Scott, for coming tonight. Thank you all for coming.